Great. I'm going to get to causality after a few minutes, I promise. But I want to start with the story. And this story is the result of me kind of wrestling with what the things that are happening in machine learning mean for me as a cognitive psychologist in the field of cognitive psychology. And the feeling that a lot of the dialogue is much too anchored on this exact moment of the technology rather than the general things that are happening. Okay, so let's consider a thought experiment. It's 2030. The Very Many Labs Consortium has completed the Psych 50 project, which is this intense 5-year effort to collect all of the experiments done in the last 50 years. They did this by using large language models to read all the method sections, generate JavaScript code and items, and then they crowdsourced replications because of all of the out of work white collar workers due to large language models. At the same time, GPT-8 was just released by the now properly named Closed AI. So this consortium runs all the experiments from the Psych 50 corpus, the last 50 years of psychology, on GPT-8 instructed to think like a human, and discovers there's this amazing convergence that the answers provided by the super language model agree with the human population, and even better, if you ask GPT-8 to think like a whole bunch of humans, you get a population of responses that reflect the human population. So of course, the New York Times runs an article, "The End of Psychology," and so then the field has to respond to this. How does the field of psychology respond? Well, add 10 more years. So 10 years later, there's a retrospective volume where there's a nice historical analysis, and it identifies 3 main viewpoints that emerged over those 10 years in psychology: applicationism, explanationism, and mechanismism. So the applicationists, they really lean into the view that the primary value of behavioral science is social impact. And so when they discover that there are now AI surrogates that let them predict how humans will respond in very complicated real-world situations, they think this is great. And they just say that's all we need in order to design interventions and use psychology the way we always wanted, including the now 2040 famous example where they intervened on the beliefs of a small Midwestern city to make them think that cricket protein was actually just as good as other kinds. And so the result is that for applicationists, theory takes a backseat. It isn't what's important in order to achieve outcomes. Okay, then there's another group of psychologists, the explanationists. And the explanationists, they hold fast to the idea that the goal of psychology is achieving an understanding of human behavior. They reject that GPT-8 itself is an explanation because they don't understand. You can't understand it. It's too big and complicated. And then they fracture a little bit. There's one group of explanationists that still believes that models can be explanations. They just need to be models that are transparent enough for humans to understand. And so then these neo-new Bayesians, maybe that's me and Todd, we build some beautiful complex Bayesian models that capture a small fragment of what GPT-8 can do. There's another group of explanationists who say, no, I can't understand your complicated Bayesian models. Only theories that can be expressed as clear verbal theories are okay for explaining behavior. And so overall, this group of psychologists says to themselves, well, they implicitly say to themselves, if explanations aren't there to increase predictive or manipulative power, what is it they're good for? Well, they're increasingly good as a kind of artistic value. This is what Feyerabend said back in Against Method, anything goes. And so it's okay, it's defined by the community what counts as a satisfying explanation, and that's what we're doing. The most radical of these subcommunities is the Reddit LE5 site community that insists that the only theories that can be considered must be understandable by school children. And then there's a final group of psychologists. These are the mechanismists. And they actually endorsed the idea that GPT-8 means that behavioral psychology is a completed endeavor. And so they lean into cognitive neuroscience. They double down and say, great, what we need to do is figure out the circuits in between the input and the output of behavior. That's what we're doing. This goes pretty well until it's discovered that the internal states of GP8, while they correlate well with neural behavior, right, at a population level, you can correlate them with what's going on in neurons. Nobody can explain what GP8 is doing in terms of understandable circuits anyhow. And so they just collect a lot of data and hope that something will change at some point. Okay, so is there hope? That was my pessimistic imagination of where we could find ourselves. I don't think it's so bad, but I do think that we need to think deeply about the kinds of rules of the game and the tools that we're using now in order to send ourselves down to a better path to the future. So, you know, explanationism requires, I think, in order to make it useful as science, constructively specifying some space of acceptable explanations, not in anything goes, but something that we think is sort of normatively acceptable or justified or something like that. Similarly, mechanismism requires some kind of tools for finding causal structure in very complicated systems, complicated networks, you know, contra my pessimism in the story on the last slide. And so one possibility that really this was brought to my attention by Thomas Eichhardt, and a lot of what I'm going to say in the next few slides is thanks to Thomas and a bunch of great collaborators. You know, maybe it's the case that simpler causal models actually can, in a very formal way, serve as explanations of more complex ones. And then what we have to do is figure out how to describe that relationship in a precise way. So this is the idea of causal abstraction. We want a mathematical theory of when one causal system is an abstraction, faithful full abstraction of another. The good news is that people smarter than me have been thinking about this for, you know, what's it been, maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years now. And the basic idea, alighting a lot of mathematical details and differences, is that if you have these two causal models, you want there to be some kind of map from the variables of the abstract model into the variables of the low level, high level, I'll call them high level and low level model, that has the property that mapping back and forth between these values commutes with interventions that you can do at the high level and the low level. So I'm going to illustrate that. I'm not going to write down the math for you all, but I'm going to walk through kind of the idea in some simple, more specific cases. So imagine that we have simple algebra, 1 + 2 × 3, and the output is 9. And we train a neural net and it can do this. And we say, hooray, it knows arithmetic. Then what we want to do is we want to understand whether it knows arithmetic in the sense that it is carrying out the algorithmic process of first adding 1 + 2 and then multiplying 3 to get the answer. So we have a high-level causal model, do those arithmetic steps, and a low-level causal model, whatever's in this neural net. And the question is, are they alignable? Can we find the right kind of function that relates them in this way? Okay, so what we want hinges on the fact that causal systems, you know, at least have to, I want to avoid saying they're fully characterized by their interventions after the talk this morning, but at least interventions are a pretty important part. That's fair, right? Maybe, yeah, okay. So if we take the high-level causal model on the right, if we reach in and change the intermediate variable 3 to something else, oops, sorry, we're trying to figure out where that intermediate variable might live on the left. Okay, so how would we know? What does it mean to have such an alignment? Well, the idea is that we will have such an alignment between something in the low-level model and something in the high-level model if it's a case that the interventions on the high-level model have a corresponding intervention on the low-level model that does the same thing, changes the relationship between input and output in the same way. So let me illustrate that. You can imagine that we reach in and we change the value from 3 to 5, right? So it goes from 5 to 3. I can do arithmetic, I promise. We change the value from 5 to 3, and now the answer on the output changes from 20 to 15. So we have this counterfactual output. This is the idea that the kind of interventions we're interested in, or that we're going to focus on at least, are these interchange interventions. This was an idea that Thomas and Atticus Geiger and Chris Potts came up with that I think is super brilliant, because it takes the very abstract notion of all of the interventions and gives us a really concrete set of cases to look at. So the cases we're interested in are the ones where we just record the value of the intermediate variable from one case, and we go and we, oops, I don't have that animated. We plug it in to another case. And so the nice thing about these interchange interventions is that they, unlike, say I could go in and say, oh, 5, I'll change it to 6, but that really depends on these numbers being numbers. Interchange interventions are perfectly well defined for arbitrary models that have arbitrary contents of the variables. So here I can go in and I can say, okay, well, if that variable is doing the same thing, it's playing the same role, then if I record the intermediate activations when I put in 2 plus 3, and I splice them in over here, when I had put in 1 plus 2, it will change the answer to the, to say 15. And furthermore, with a little bit of math to make this precise, I can say the extent to which I get the correct counterfactual answer from doing that interchange intervention is a measure of how close the alignment is to having worked, what we call the IIA, or alignment score. Okay. So the basic picture here is that if I've hypothesized a high-level causal model, and I have a target low-level causal model, I next have to come up with an alignment between the variables in the high-level model and the low-level model. And then I can do this swapping, this interchange intervention, to see whether the variable over here plays the same causal role as the variable over there. Parentheses, caveats with respect to the inputs that we're using to test this, which we can talk about later. Okay, that's straightforward, except for the fact that when I just look at this neural net, I don't really have any idea where that intermediate, sum of two variables should live, right? Big pile of neural net activations. I don't know what it does. So a lot of the interesting work that's been happening in the, collective of causal reasoning people at Stanford the last couple of years, and really spearheaded by Atticus Geiger, who's a brilliant student who just graduated, has been finding ways to much more effectively and efficiently search for and find the populations in the low level that implement variables in a high level model, if they're there, of course. So the main one that I want to tell you about today hinges on the idea that we first need to move from thinking in a localist way about the representations in the network to a distributed way. So what do I mean by that? Well, rather than saying, one plus two variable, I'm going to say this is a vector space, and I'm interested in whether there's some direction, some subspace of that vector space that represents that information. That's the classic kind of PDP connectionist idea that important conceptual variables won't be necessarily represented in, say, single neurons. They'll be represented in some superposition of neurons, some direction in the vector space. Okay, so given that that's the case, there's an interesting fact from linear algebra, which is that you can basically find vectors by leaving the vectors where they are and changing the basis. And so the basic idea is what we're going to do to search for a variable that could align is we're going to pick out some dimensionality of the subspace. We'll relax that in a minute. And then we will try to come up with a rotation. That's the next slide. We will try to come up with a rotation such that when you do it, do the swap over, say, the first k dimensions, and then undo the swap. You have the right counterfactual behavior. Now, the idea here is basically all we're actually doing is allowing ourselves to use the modern tools of gradient based optimization in order to look for a subspace of all of the neurons that represents that high level variable. We're not actually changing the neural net or the high level model in any way. Okay. And you guys should interrupt me if this is totally unclear. Good. So good. We go forth and we do that. Let me give you an example. So there's this very simple computation that's been kicking around the psychology, especially developmental psychology world for some decades, called hierarchical equality. You might recognize it as one of Gary Marcus's favorite reasons that neural nets can't do stuff. And hierarchical equality is a really kind of cool but simple computation. It says you're going to have 4 inputs, W, X, Y, and Z, and you first check whether the first 2 inputs are the same, and you get, true or false. You check whether the second 2 inputs are the same, true or false, and then you check whether those 2 variables are the same, right? Both true or both false. So what you can do is you can train a neural net. You can just say, great, I'm going to generate a whole lot of data, but it's consistent with that rule. So, 1, 1, 2, 2, yeah, that's true. 2, 1, 3, 3, that's false because these 2 are different, but these 2 are the same, and so on. Okay. So then you can train a neural net, and that's generate data, train the neural net. You get a neural net. It turns out that this was not something that I expected, but it turns out that actually even pretty small neural nets, not even big old transformers, can solve this task perfectly well, and can even generalize. But you have the question of whether those neural nets are carrying out that computation just by some kind of approximate embedded dynamical system-y cool thing, or whether they're actually implementing the symbolic computation, right? This is a question that I think had worried me for a long time. When can we say a neural net actually implements a symbolic model? And before this line of work that sort of Thomas showed me, I had no way of answering that question or thinking about it. So we set out to use this causal abstraction method to analyze the neural net that we trained on this task. And what we did is we explored 3 different possible high-level models. So the first one is the one that actually we use to generate the data, 2 intermediate things. The second one is one where you generate 1 intermediate value and then just have a single function to combine the remaining things together. And the third one is the one that actually doesn't have any intermediate variables. It does sort of a copy and then a combine. The critical thing about these is just that they are 3 different functionally equivalent ways to compute the same thing. Okay, and then we went and we looked for the variables and in the neural net and asked, are these causally represented? Is there a distributed representation of each of these variables that does the right thing when you swap out activations from other examples? And the result, which was pretty surprising to me, is that yes, in fact, this is varying the dimensionality of the subspace. So how much room do you give this variable to use? And as long as you give the variable enough room to use, you can find it exactly represented. So in the details don't matter very much, but basically somewhere in layer 1 of this fully connected network, you actually find an exact representation of the 2 intermediate variables being computed. This is a really strong thing to be able to say, right? It's saying that this neural net, that if you look at it, is just it's a dynamical system. It's a pile of weights. In some kind of useful, mathematically precise sense, is implementing the symbolic computation. It's also worth saying maybe 2 other things, which is that this isn't there's many ways to implement that computation that are not implemented in the neural net, so those and others. And also it's distributed. If you went and started looking for a localist representation of those 2 variables, you wouldn't find it. We sort of do 2 different versions of that on the bottom. And so, it's doing the symbolic thing in the distributed way, I guess basically like Jay McClelland has been saying for a really long time. But the only way to find it is by knowing the causal relationships that you're looking for. Okay. Yes, thank you. No, what did we settle on? What does that mean? I'm joking. Okay, I want to then describe taking this same basic idea. Now we want to scale it up. Like obviously what we'd like to do is we'd like to go analyze GPT-8 or at least a reasonably large transformer. The first thing we have to do that I'll go through, I'll just kind of skip over, is we have to extend the algorithm just a little bit to allow it to search more efficiently. And the critical thing here is we don't want to have to determine the size of the representation ahead of time. So we do this thing where we sort of relax the boundaries so we can have learn filters, and then we can take derivatives and it can figure out how much space it wants. It's technically useful, but not that important. And then we have a new name, we call it boundless distributed abstraction search. And cool. Then we go and we say, great, when we were doing this, the best open source transformer that we could get our hands on was this one called Alpaca. And the biggest one we could fit on our GPUs was 7 billion parameters, which is still big enough to actually do things, right? Like it can do some things. Not, by the way, as many things as I was hoping. It took us a little while to find a task that it was like sufficiently good at to be worth analyzing. But we found this task where we say, now in kind of chat mode, right? Please say yes only if it costs between $3.50 and $5.50. Otherwise, no. You give a price for $4.10. And it says yes. Okay, so there's the task. And then we can ask, great, how is the transformer carrying out that extremely simple computation? And so the high level model that we want to explore, a kind of natural hypothesis is that what it's doing is it is sort of computing the intermediate variables of comparing the price that we give it to the lower bound, comparing it to the upper bound, and then combining those, taking the conjunction to figure out if it counts. Okay. Okay, there are alternatives. There's like other ways you could do this computation. So like I kind of like this one as an alternative, which is not crazy, which is you compute the midpoint of the interval and then you measure the absolute distance to the midpoint. It's like a totally fine way you could do this, right? And importantly, it's the same input-output function. It only differs in the mechanism and the causal kind of steps you go through. Okay. So this is a big old heat map. These four correspond to looking for the causal representation of those four different causal models. And the basic finding here, so the first thing to say, which is annoying and requires a lot of further thought, is that the task performance, Alpaca only gets 85% of these right, even though it's very simple. And so kind of the ceiling counterfactual performance is around that. So, when we see 0.85, 0.88, somewhere in that range, what we're seeing is like the best you could do at causally representing these things. This is basically a heat map showing the layers of the Alpaca model and then the tokens of input. And the number is the intervention accuracy score of looking for the representations of the causal variables, the high-level causal variables, somewhere in that layer, somewhere in that part of the transformer. Okay, so the first result is that it does look like the transformer is representing this computation based on computing the boundaries and putting them together, and not something like my favorite algorithm, the midpoint distance computation. Okay. The second thing, which I think is even more interesting, is that so now we have this set of directions, these representations, which are some subspaces of the transformer activations. And we can ask, okay, are those still the causally relevant directions if we change the task? So if we generalize a little bit, are they still the representations? Because it's possible that the transformer, as soon as you change anything, it puts its information in some completely different place. So for instance, we can take our basic task and we can add a random prefix that could in principle interfere in all sorts of ways with the computation. And the result is that those representations are relatively stable to this change, to adding random prefixes. They're also, we can also sort of generalize in a very minimal sense, generalize the task from saying yes or no to saying true or false. And you could imagine, like, transformers do all sorts of stuff. But it turns out those representations are conserved. The same representations are still how the transformer computes the answers to this slight twist. Okay, what's the takeaway? What are my thoughts? Well, first of all, some things that we still need. We need much better tools for finding the abstract computations. Here I posit them and we go look to see if they align, but that is painful. We need much better math for thinking about approximate abstractions and thinking about like kind of intermediate interchange intervention accuracy. And then there's kind of deeper questions like when is it that a causal abstraction feels like it yields a useful understanding of the low-level system? Is it anyone? Does it have to be simple? Does it have to be something? And then maybe just the last thing I'll mention is the question that I brought up in my story earlier, which is we still don't know. It's a hypothesis we have to explore, but it could turn out that very complicated large language model systems are just not coverable by a set of these kind of understandable causal abstractions. And so I think that's something we really need to think pretty hard about. Thanks.
So I'm going to be honest, I did not follow everything about that, but I was very interested in the back part, especially about the alignment that you're talking about, because you kind of define it as essentially some sort of mapping. And I just want to ask whether you have an intuition as to, is this mapping an homomorphism, an isomorphism, or are you talking about complements?
Oh, it's a commutative diagram.
Okay.
It is not a homomorphism or an isomorphism because you expect to lose structure when you go from the low-level model to the high-level model. Okay. So I don't remember what that makes it. Do you know what that makes it?
It can be a homomorphism of a particular structure to another structure where the algebraic operation, binary operation is composition of interventions.
Yeah. I guess one thing I'll say, which is not, directly responding, but we, very broadly speaking, are trying to figure out a more algebraic notion of this that involves looking at interventional algebras and how they interact. And I think it's closer to the question you're asking.
So you don't really have a fixed answer as to what kind of alignment this is, but you just have an intuition that there is some sort of alignment and you don't really know like what's mathematically is.
No. I mean, there's a very definite, the papers, kind of laid out, there is a very definite property that these mappings have to have. It's a set of mappings that have a certain commutativity property, which basically says that with respect to the interventions you're interested in, you can get the causal effects, the counterfactual effects, either at the low level or at the high level, and they'll agree.
So since we just had a question in the weeds, I'll ask another. I like the idea of aligning high-level abstractions and low-level ones by aligning vectors in space, but that seems to require that there is a definition of what it means to have a vector representing something in a high-level space. I can't imagine how that would work in recurrent problem. Maybe so. Even in a time of feed-forward problem that you can talk about, it's not obvious to me how you define direction clearly, but maybe there is one.
In the low level space or the high level space?
No, I don't.
Oh, the high level space, you don't have to have vectors. So this is the beauty of interchange intervention. So the high level space, you have some values of the variables. You record a value, you swap it in for a different input. That might not be a vector itself. The low level model, because here in these applications, I'm assuming that it's a vector so that there's a notion of subspace. But the critical property is just that whatever it is, it's a thing I can record from one input and splice in when I'm processing another input. Right. Recurrent models are kind of hard for their own reason. As long as you have a particular time at which you think the variable is to be represented, everything is straightforward. If you don't know when, it's complicated.
Realize there are tons more hands.